So, you finally decided to do it. You finally decided to grab the reins for yourself, claim the throne, and become a game master. Perhaps you decided to step up to the plate because you wanted to give your forever GM a break, or perhaps maybe you're one of the truly unsung heroes of the TTRPG space and volunteered to be a game master. Regardless though, the path ahead of you is a difficult one, filled with the many different types of bumps and so forth that us GMs have to deal with on a regular basis that goes normally completely unnoticed by our players. Being a GM can be difficult, but that's what I'm here for, and it's what this video is about. But before I begin, as a quick disclaimer, everyone's GM journey and experience is going to be drastically different from one another, and these tips and tricks and so forth that I'm going to be sharing are my own personal opinions and some things that I wish I was told back when I was first becoming a game master. Obviously, everyone's journey is going to be different, and everyone's going to have different opinions and experiences for what type of GMing experience they want to give to their players, and obviously their own GMing style. These are just the things that I learned over the course of my 10 years or so being a game master, and things that I wish that someone had approached me and said, hey, maybe you shouldn't do that, or maybe you should avoid doing this. And also, for clarification, this video is not going to be like the multitude of other videos out there that are going to be about how to be a great GM, or how to do this as a GM, or how to prepare your dungeon, or so forth. This is just going to be including some honest opinions from me, being an experienced GM, to you perhaps not being a very experienced GM, and what I would recommend you do when running your first campaign or your first couple of sessions. But while this video is directed towards newer GMs, if you're a veteran GM or perhaps a veteran player and you're watching this video, maybe leave a comment down below with some of the tips and tricks that you've learned over the course of your GMing career and things that you would like to share with new upcoming GMs. But to kick things off with the first thing that I wish someone had told me about when I was first becoming a GM, do not go overboard with your first campaign or your first session. Your first campaign does not need to be this super elaborate and in-depth campaign filled with battles with the gods, elaborate political intrigue, and plots to overthrow entire kingdoms and so forth. Your first campaign should be small, manageable, and gives you a good idea of what is expected of you as a GM. Because while you may be an expert when it comes to being a player or watching shows like Critical Role or Dimension 20, being a GM is a very different experience, and there is a ton of work that goes on behind the scenes that the GM has to do in order to craft the wonderful and exciting adventure that you as the player get to enjoy by just creating a character and showing up to the session. So what I would recommend you do is starting off with a pre-made adventure, or perhaps a one-shot that is also pre-made that has all of the work done for you in terms of the NPCs, the dungeons, the encounters, and so forth. Adventures like The Lost Mine of Phandelver or The Menace under Otari, for example, are fantastic adventures that get you used to being the GM by giving you tips and tricks of how to run adventures, and most systems have a designated beginner adventure that is specifically directed towards new players and or GMs. And to add on to that, sometimes running an entire campaign can be way too much work for you as a GM because you may not have the time to truly commit to it, to memorizing or perhaps committing to memory all of the NPCs, the dungeons, the magical items, the loot, and all of the loot and magical items that is given to you or awarded to the players by NPCs or those dungeons and so forth. And it can be a lot to manage as a GM, especially if it's a very long campaign. Which is why I would recommend, if you're a new player, or a new GM I should say, to maybe look at some one-shots, or perhaps a couple of different one-shots to run for your players to get a good idea of what an average 3 to 5 hour session should look like. And keep in mind, not every one-shot is a typical session in a campaign, but it gives you a good idea of how a structure for an adventure should be, whether it be like starting off and getting a plot hook, interacting with NPCs, then fighting the big bad at the end of the dungeon or the end of the encounter or quest line and so forth. But going back to using a pre-made campaign, The Lost Mine of Phandelver is a great example for a standard campaign that has a good plot hook and great adventures, dungeons, and NPCs placed along the way until eventually you reach the grand finale. One of the best parts about this adventure is that it's completely free and does all of the work for you regarding creating plot hooks, dungeons and descriptions for each room, NPCs and their appearance, and it does a fantastic job of showing you what a standard adventure should look like from start to finish. And at this point you may be thinking, well, I don't want to use some lousy pre-made adventure or campaign because I want to create my own world, complete with my own NPCs, dungeons, magic items, and so forth. And that's perfectly fine, because that's what I did. But I would still recommend using or running a pre-made adventure or one-shot to give you a good idea of what you should do with your own world or adventure, and give you a good template for what you should follow and what kind of story beats you should hit along your campaign. Because while you can easily look up how to create a good D&D campaign online and get tons of resources, it can sometimes be difficult to put those resources, tips, and tricks into practice when it's your first time being a GM and you haven't run a session yet, let alone a campaign, and don't know what goes into every session in terms of preparing and writing the NPCs, dungeons, and different things your characters can do in those dungeons and with the NPCs and so forth. But if you're still dead set on creating your own adventure and your own world of your own creation with your own writing, NPCs, dungeons, magical items, and the like, or perhaps maybe you just want to take a pre-made adventure and use it as a template so that way you can write your own adventure within the guidelines of that other adventure or so forth, here is what I would recommend. Do not create the entire campaign, adventure, or your own world at once. Start small, work big. Creating your own world is a ton of work, let me tell you, and sometimes it doesn't get as much appreciation as it deserves. And if it's your first time creating a world, then you might get completely overwhelmed with all the intricacies and details that need to be fleshed out, or perhaps when your players ask you a question about something and you don't have that prepared, it can feel pretty bad when you don't have an answer for them. So because of this, what I would recommend you do is you begin your adventure in perhaps a town or a village, or if you're very bold, a city, and then slowly expand the world around your players and their characters as they venture into it. This way, you're not spending all of your time preparing for the session by just creating the world that the adventure takes place in, because otherwise, if you do that, then once the adventure begins and your players begin to explore and try to find plot hooks and so forth, if there isn't any of that, and there isn't any adventures or things that you've prepared in terms of dungeons, monster encounters, and so forth, then the entire world can seem a bit hollow. And you don't need to create entire intricate maps of nations, continents, and political boundaries when it's your first time creating a world. A nice local map with some interesting things scattered around it that may or may not be related to the campaign will do just fine. And the nice part about starting small is that you don't have to concern yourself or your players with having to come up with or know the names of bordering nations, the local cities, or the dozens of local taverns, shops, and their owners, and what they have for sale, and so forth. If you start in a small town, there is probably only one tavern, one blacksmith, one general store, and perhaps some other small businesses that you might want to add. Then you, as the GM, can come up with some of the names for those locations and the NPCs that own them super simply, and the amount of NPCs that you have to keep track of is drastically smaller than if you were to start your adventure in a massive city, or if your adventure were to take place over multiple different cities, continents, or perhaps different planes of existence. But whether or not you decide to use a pre-made adventure, or perhaps decide to write and create your own world and your own adventure, the one thing that I would recommend you do not use, or at the very least use sparingly, are random encounters and random encounter roll tables. The reason why I say this is because when I first started out, I thought that big random encounter tables were super cool and added some true randomness to a game session when even me, being the GM, doesn't know what could happen, right? But because of this randomness combined with my own inexperience, it led to a couple of disastrous situations where I didn't know what the monsters I was piloting could do, or I wasn't familiar with what occurred on a particular roll on the random encounter table, because after all, not all random encounters are explicitly hostile ones. This, combined with the fact that I hadn't prepared for most of the random encounters besides making a battle map and maybe preparing a couple of tokens if I needed them, led to a lot of confusion on my part and really bogged down the session when I had to look up particular rules or what would occur during a random encounter. This, combined with the fact that if you're using a pre-made adventure, and in that pre-made adventure there is a roll table with dozens of encounters on it, or perhaps you're making your own adventure and you're having to look up a random encounter online that potentially has hundreds of different random encounters, then it can lead to a lot of stress on your part because you think that you have to prepare for all of those outcomes, when in reality you don't have to make a random encounter fun or to implement a random encounter into your session. While random encounters are super fun if you can handle them, one of your goals as a GM should be to keep the game moving while also making sure that your players are having a good time, and sometimes random encounters get in the way of this and can really slow down a session when you didn't prepare for every possible outcome on a random encounter table And if you're a first-time GM or an unexperienced GM, it can lead to a lot of unnecessary stress and hassle on your part. On top of this, if you throw a random encounter at the party every single time they go adventuring or go into the forest or so forth, then sessions turn less into chasing after the hobgoblins that perhaps captured the mayor, and instead turn into entire sessions that are focused on random encounters that completely slow down and extend the longevity, or the runtime I should say, of the entire campaign, which if you're on a time restriction for your party and you only have a month to complete a campaign, that is a big issue. And if you still want to use random encounters in your campaigns or during your sessions, that's perfectly fine, because I know that I still did back when I was first starting, even though I probably shouldn't have. But if you decide to use random encounters, here is what I would recommend. Make sure that the random encounter tables are simple, and they do not go overboard with the amount of encounters that could occur. While it is very cool if there are random encounters out there with hundreds of possibilities, that can be a lot for you as a GM to try to manage. If you want to use random encounters and you want to prepare for all of the possible outcomes that are on the random encounter roll table, then get used to the feeling of having spent tons of time preparing for encounters that just never happen. Because players always find a way to either avoid a situation or to, of course, just avoid entire encounters, whether it be through luck from them rolling on the roll table and then avoiding them, or perhaps just not encountering them entirely. But of course, you can't run an adventure without your players, which is my next point. So perhaps you want to run a custom adventure that is politically themed or has heavy role-playing aspects, or perhaps you want to run a pre-made adventure that is a massive dungeon crawl filled with traps, exciting encounters, and puzzles, and so forth. But before you do that, and perhaps before you choose what adventure or what pre-made adventure you want to run, or even begin sitting down and writing your adventure, ask yourself this: who are you writing or choosing the adventure for? Are you choosing or writing it for yourself, or are you writing it for your players? I'm saying this because the players are the focus of the game. They're the heroes who are fighting against evil, the group of miscreants who got caught up in a beholder's plot to overthrow the city, and the champions of the realm. The campaign doesn't happen and the story doesn't play out if your players aren't enjoying themselves, or you can't keep them coming back to the table with continued interest and excitement, which is why you need to be aware of what types of players you're running the game for. This is why I would recommend having a session 0 with your party and discussing what type of adventure they want, and help them create their characters, or at least be part of the process in some way or another, so that we can get a good idea of what type of characters they want to play. Whether it be the muscle-strapped barbarian who's going to be constantly trying to grab his enemies and throwing them off a cliff, or perhaps the ranger who's sitting back from afar in the shadows and shooting enemies with his bow. But you may be confused what I mean by a Session 0, so to give you a quick summary, a Session 0 is essentially a session that occurs before the campaign begins that allows the GM to go over expectations between themselves and the players, as well as covering some ground rules and help with character creation and so forth. So during your Session 0, if you haven't decided what type of adventure you want to run for your players yet, this would be the time to ask them what adventure they want to be a part of. While you are the final factor in deciding what adventure is run, the campaign doesn't begin if there aren't any players. So I would recommend asking your players what type of adventure they want to be in and what kind of story they want to tell in that adventure and so forth, and then combine that with your own expectations and wants for the adventure and try to find a happy medium. And if you can't find one that's a pre-made, then maybe just modify a pre-made adventure. Do your players want to be swashbuckling pirates in a seafaring-themed adventure, or perhaps an adventure where they all are thieves trying to make a name for themselves in the big city? Or maybe they just want a classic adventure filled with Dungeons and Dragons. While I wouldn't really recommend you do a seafaring adventure or perhaps a big city-themed adventure, especially if it's your first time GMing, what I would recommend is that you at least do a Session 0, because they are invaluable to you as the GM for understanding what type of adventure and story your players want and how you can facilitate that via your own creation and imagination. And by asking your players directly what type of experience they want to have or what expectations they might have for an adventure, you now know what kind of beats your adventure should hit. And you don't have to stumble around like a blind bull in a china shop trying to guess what the right type of campaign for your players is. You can just ask them directly and find out for yourself. But now that you know to keep things small and simple and gradually build it outwards, and to be cautious when using random encounter tables, and perhaps maybe you've chosen your own pre-made adventure or have began writing your own adventure, you maybe are ready to begin your very first campaign and start and run your very first session for your players. But before you do, My last little tidbit of knowledge to you is this. Being a GM is not about winning the game or killing the party, because obviously we know as GMs that we could easily do that if we wanted to. Being a GM is not about running a massive globe-trotting campaign complete with super in-depth character plots and elaborate schemes to overthrow kingdoms or kill the gods or so forth. Being a GM is telling a fun story while also playing a fun role-playing game. So make sure that you just prepare for your sessions, take a deep breath before your sessions, and make sure that you are having fun. Because while it is important that your players are having fun, are you not a player as well? If you're not having fun being the GM, express that to your players. Be honest and don't force yourself behind the GM screen if you're not enjoying it, and don't run a campaign if you don't want to. While the focus of the game is the players, and you're the game master who is meant to facilitate the game, you're also a player, and you should also be having a good time. You as the game master are the facilitator of this experience for your players. You are the mastermind behind every NPC, every monster, the big bad evil guy that's at the very end of this campaign, and so forth. The game cannot and will not happen without you at the helm. And if you want to take a break, or maybe you're not having fun, that's perfectly fine. Maybe it's time for another player to take the reins for a little bit and experience being a GM. Because after all, being a GM does not have to be a permanent thing. While in most cases a GM for a group remains the same for months or perhaps years and claims the cursed title of Forever GM, it does not have to be that way for you. You do not have to be the game master forever. And sometimes it's important for other players to realize that being the game master is difficult and can sometimes be stressful depending upon your situation and how much time you have to dedicate to preparing for every session. And by allowing other players to take the reins for a little bit and give you a break, or perhaps give other players a chance to be a GM and see if they like it or not, it can perhaps open up a gateway for other players to a new hobby that they really enjoy or a new way that they can play the game, and also give other players the experience of running campaigns and running adventures rather than playing those campaigns or playing through those adventures. Because, as I'm sure you may know, being a game master is a completely different experience to playing the game as opposed to being a player. Because if you're a player, pretty much all you have to do is make your character, maybe make a backstory or not, maybe show up to the session and take notes or not, and have fun, of course, with your friends in this world and adventure that the GM has prepared for you. But as I just mentioned, that is a world and an adventure that GM has to prepare. And if it's a pre-made adventure, you have to familiarize yourself with all of the NPCs, the dungeons, the monsters, the plot line, and all the rules that will come up during that adventure and so forth. And that's not even taking into account perhaps the hours or maybe days that you have spent potentially preparing for this or making your own world and your own custom adventure. Which is why I would recommend to you as the game master, if you've been running this session or this campaign, I should say, for a couple of weeks or a couple of months now, and it's your first experience or time being a game master, and you just don't like it, or maybe you're just feeling fatigued and need to take a break, be honest with your players and just say, hey guys, no session next week because I'm feeling a bit burnt out, and maybe I just don't like being a GM as much as I thought I did, so I'm going to be stepping down for a little bit, or maybe stepping down entirely. And if that's the case, then that's perfectly fine because you're being honest and you're not forcing yourself to be the game master if you don't want to, because again, you're a player and you deserve to have fun. And obviously this opens a door for other players to step up and say, hey, no worries, I'll run a one-shot in your stead while you're taking a break, or I actually want to try being a game master for a little bit, so let's actually run this adventure if you don't mind, and so forth. And then that potentially gives them the chance to find their passion for being a game master, or perhaps for you to rekindle your flame to be a game master again at some point. But with that, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and if you got to this point in the video and you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like. And obviously, if you're a veteran GM and you want to share some of your tidbits of knowledge with some of these new game masters that may come to this video, then please feel free to leave those tips and tricks in the comments down below. But anyways, thank you again for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.